Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people's story, The Background. My wife and I bought our first home about 3 years ago. It's a modest 3-bedroom ranch-style house on a half-acre lot in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The property has mature trees, decent privacy, and a particularly nice stretch of land along the eastern side that gets perfect morning sunlight. That's where I decided to put in a vegetable garden when we first moved in. The house had been vacant for about 8 months before we purchased it. The previous owners were an elderly couple who moved to Florida to be closer to their kids. According to our realtor, the wife had maintained beautiful flower beds, but they had become overgrown during the vacancy. I was excited to bring them back to life and add my own vegetable garden to the mix. Our neighborhood is mostly friendly. We have a mix of retirees, young families, and a few single folks. We're not the kind of people who host block parties or anything, but we wave to each other and occasionally chat when we're both outside at the same time, except for one neighbor, the lady who lives directly to the east of us, who I'll call Karen, not her real name. From day one, Karen had been difficult. She's in her late 50s, lives alone, and seems to have nothing better to do than monitor everyone else's business. When we first moved in, she came over with a sad excuse for a welcome basket, a few stale cookies, and a pamphlet for her church, and proceeded to tell us all about the neighborhood rules. "We don't put our garbage cans out before 6 p.m. the night before pickup," she informed us sternly, "and we bring them back in by noon on collection day. The HOA has strict guidelines about exterior paint colors and lawn maintenance," she continued, even though our neighborhood doesn't actually have an HOA. "And we're very particular about noise after 8 p.m., she added with a pointed look at our moving boxes labeled vinyl records and stereo equipment. I nodded politely and thanked her for the welcome, but internally I was already dreading having her as a neighbor. My wife squeezed my hand as if to say, "Just smile and nod, we'll deal with her later." For the most part, we managed to avoid direct conflict with Karen for the first couple of years. We'd get the occasional passive-aggressive note about our lawn being half an inch too tall or our holiday decorations being excessive, but nothing major, until the garden dispute began. The Tutandau incident. It was a beautiful Sunday in early May, and I was excited to get my vegetable garden planted for the season. I'd started my seedlings indoors weeks earlier, and they were ready to be transplanted. The weather forecast was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with a gentle breeze. I started working around 10 a.m., turning over the soil in my garden plot, which runs along the eastern edge of our property, adjacent to Karen's lawn. I had my headphones in, jamming to my favorite playlist while I worked. I was completely in the zone, enjoying the feel of the soil in my hands and the satisfaction of preparing the earth for new growth. After about an hour of work, I felt a tap on my shoulder that nearly made me jump out of my skin. I turned around to find Karen standing there, arms crossed, with a look on her face that could curdle milk. I pulled out my earbuds. "Hey, Karen, what's up?" "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I looked down at my clearly gardening-related tools and soil-covered hands. Gardening? Getting my vegetables planted for the season?" "Not on my property, you're not," she snapped. I was confused. "What do you mean, your property? This is my garden plot, same as it's been for the past 2 years. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "This land has always been part of my property. The previous owners were friends of mine, and I allowed them to garden here as a courtesy, but that agreement was with them, not you." This was news to me. "Karen, I'm pretty sure this is within my property line. It was included in our purchase." "Well, you're wrong," she said firmly. "I've lived here for 20 years, and I know exactly where the property line is. It runs along that row of bushes over there." She pointed to a line of hydrangeas that were definitely well within our property. I tried to remain calm. "I don't think that's correct. Our survey shows—" "I don't care what your survey shows," she interrupted. "This is my land, and you're trespassing. I want you to remove all of this." She gestured broadly at my garden plot. "Immediately." "Look, Karen, I'm not removing my garden. I'm confident this is my property, but if you have concerns, we can look at the property records together." "Don't patronize me," she hissed. "I've already called the police. They'll straighten this out." My jaw dropped. "You called the police? Over a gardening dispute?" "For trespassing," she corrected. "And destruction of property. Those are crimes, you know." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Karen, this is ridiculous. Why don't we—" "Save it for the police," she snapped, then turned and marched back to her house. I stood there, garden trowel in hand, completely dumbfounded. Did my neighbor seriously just call the cops on me for gardening on my own property? I shook my head and pulled out my phone to call my wife, who was grocery shopping. "Hey, you're not going to believe this," I started when she picked up. I quickly explained the situation. She did what? My wife exclaimed. That's insane. Do you want me to come home? No, finish the shopping. I've got this. I'm going to grab the property documents from the office. I know we have the survey in there somewhere. After hanging up, I went inside to wash my hands and find our property documents. When we bought the house, we had a proper survey done, and I was 100% certain that my garden was well within our property line. I found the folder with all of our closing documents and pulled out the survey map, along with our deed. I also grabbed my phone and went back outside to take some photos of the garden area in dispute, just to document the current state of things. While I was doing this, I noticed Karen watching me from her window. I ignored her and continued gathering evidence. About 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up in front of our houses. A single officer got out and approached me. "Good afternoon, sir," he said. "I'm Officer Reynolds. We received a call about a property dispute." "That's right, officer," I replied, trying to stay calm and professional. "My neighbor seems to think I'm gardening on her property, but I've got documentation showing this is my land." Just then, Karen came bustling out of her house, waving her arms dramatically. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This man is trespassing on my property and destroying my lawn to plant his vegetables." Officer Reynolds held up a hand. "Ma'am, please calm down. I'm here to sort this out." "There's nothing to sort out," Karen insisted. "This is my property. It always has been. I have documents." "I have documents too," I said, holding up my folder. The officer sighed slightly. "All right, let's all take a breath. Property disputes like this are usually civil matters, not criminal. But I'm happy to look at what you both have." I handed over my survey and deed first. Officer Reynolds studied them carefully, particularly the survey map with the clearly marked property lines. Karen then thrust a yellowed piece of paper at him. "This is the original plot map from when the subdivision was built in 1978, she announced triumphantly. "As you can see, the property line extends to those hydrangeas." Officer Reynolds looked at her document, then back at my modern survey. "Ma'am, this is an old developer's marketing brochure, not a legal survey. And even on this rough sketch, I don't see anything indicating the property line is where you're claiming." Karen's face flushed again. "Well, I've lived here for 20 years, and that's where the property line has always been. Possession is 9/10 of the law, you know." The officer turned to me. "Sir, when did you purchase this property?" "About 3 years ago," I replied. "We had a proper survey done as part of the closing process. That's what I've shown you." Officer Reynolds nodded. "Based on the documentation I'm seeing, this appears to be legally your property, sir. There's no evidence of trespassing." Karen looked like she might explode. "That's ridiculous! Check the county records. This has always been my land." "Ma'am," Officer Reynolds said patiently, "I'm not a property assessor or a judge. Based on what I've seen, there's no evidence of a crime being committed here. This is a civil matter, and if you believe there's a discrepancy in the property lines, you'll need to pursue that through proper legal channels." "So you're just going to let him steal my land?" Karen demanded. "I'm not stealing anything," I interjected. "This is my property." "Please, both of you," Officer Reynolds said firmly. "As I've stated, this is a civil matter. If you can't come to an agreement, you'll need to resolve it through civil court. In the meantime, sir, you're not committing any crime by gardening on what appears to be your property according to the legal survey." Karen was fuming. "This isn't over," she snapped, then turned and stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. Officer Reynolds turned to me with a slightly apologetic look. "Sorry about this. We get calls like this more often than you'd think." "No problem, officer. I appreciate you handling it professionally," he nodded. "Just a word of advice, you might want to consider getting a property marker survey done with visible stakes if this continues to be an issue. And document everything." "Good idea," I replied. "Thank you." After Officer Reynolds left, I went back to my gardening, though my peaceful mood was thoroughly ruined. I couldn't believe Karen had escalated things to this level. Over a vegetable garden. It wasn't like I was building a junkyard or running a noisy business. I was growing tomatoes and peppers, for crying out loud. When my wife got home with the groceries, she was furious on my behalf. "She actually called the cops on you?" she exclaimed as she helped me plant the last of my seedlings. "That's a whole new level of crazy." "Yeah, and I have a feeling this isn't over," I replied. "Officer Reynolds suggested we get property markers installed." "That's probably a good idea," my wife agreed. "And maybe we should think about setting up some security cameras too." "Already looking into it," I said, showing her my phone where I had a tab open to a home security system. Little did I know how essential that security system would soon become, the Escalation. The next morning, I left for work at my usual time around 7:30 a.m. Everything seemed normal and Karen's house was quiet as I backed out of the driveway. But when I returned home that evening, I was greeted with a shocking sight. My entire vegetable garden had been destroyed. The newly planted seedlings were uprooted and strewn about. The soil was disturbed, with deep gouges as if someone had taken a shovel to it. Even the small decorative border I had installed was smashed to pieces. I stood there in disbelief, trying to process the destruction before me. There was no question in my mind who was responsible, but I couldn't believe Karen would go this far. My wife came out to see what was keeping me in the yard. Her gasp was audible. "What happened?" "Karen happened," I said grimly, pulling out my phone to document the damage. "This is vandalism, plain and simple." "We need to call the police," my wife said, already pulling out her own phone. This time, we got a different officer, a woman named Officer Chen. She was thorough, taking multiple photos of the damage and noting down my account of the previous day's events. "Do you have any security cameras that might have captured this?" she asked. "Not yet," I admitted. "We were literally just talking about installing some yesterday after the property dispute." Officer Chen nodded. "Without direct evidence, it's going to be hard to prove who did this. But we'll file a report for the vandalism, and I'll pay a visit to your neighbor to ask some questions." I watched from our front window as Officer Chen went next door and knocked on Karen's door. Karen answered, looking the picture of innocence. They spoke for several minutes before Officer Chen returned to her car and drove away. About an hour later, my doorbell rang. It was Officer Chen again. "Sir, I spoke with your neighbor. She denies any knowledge of the vandalism and claims she was at a doctor's appointment all day. Without eyewitnesses or video evidence, there's not much more we can do at this point." I nodded, frustrated but not surprised. "I understand. Thank you for your help." After Officer Chen left, my wife and I sat down to formulate a plan. "We need those security cameras ASAP," she said, "and I think we should go ahead with the property marker survey too." "Agreed," I replied, "and I'm going to replant the garden tomorrow. I'm not letting her win this." The next day was Saturday, and I took a personal day off work to deal with everything. First thing in the morning, I called a local surveyor and arranged for them to come out the following Monday to place official property markers. It was an expense we hadn't planned for, but it felt necessary given the circumstances. Then I went to the local home improvement store and bought a comprehensive security camera system with 4 cameras that could cover all sides of our property. I also picked up new seedlings to replace the ones that had been destroyed. While my wife installed the security system, she's the tech-savvy one in our relationship, I set about re-establishing my garden. I was determined not to let Karen's intimidation tactics work. As I was working, I noticed Karen watching me from her window again. I gave her a friendly wave, just to let her know that I wasn't intimidated. She quickly disappeared from view. By the end of the day, we had our security cameras up and running and my garden was replanted. We had positioned one camera specifically to monitor the garden area with a clear view of the property line. The weekend passed without incident, and on Monday, the surveyor came out as scheduled. He was very thorough, using GPS and the official property records to place metal stakes at each corner of our property. He also ran a bright pink string between the stakes to visibly mark the boundary line. As I suspected, my garden was well within our property. In fact, the actual boundary was about 3 feet beyond where I had been gardening. I had been giving Karen more space than I needed to. The surveyor provided us with an official, notarized document confirming the property lines, which I made several copies of. One for our files, one to keep in a safe deposit box, and one just in case we needed to show it to the police again. That evening, Karen came marching over, waving her arms at the survey stakes and pink string. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. "You can't just come and put stakes on my property." I smiled calmly. "These aren't on your property, Karen. We had an official survey done today. These markers show the legal boundary between our properties, as recorded in the county land records." "This is absolutely ridiculous," she sputtered. "These stakes are wrong. Your surveyor obviously made a mistake." "Feel free to hire your own surveyor," I replied, still keeping my cool. "But until then, these are the official boundaries. Oh, and by the way, we've installed security cameras that monitor our property now, including my garden." I pointed to the visible camera mounted on the corner of our house. "Just so you know." Karen's face went through a range of emotions: anger, surprise, and then something like fear. Without another word, she turned and stomped back to her house. I had a feeling the visible security cameras and survey stakes would discourage any further vandalism, but I still waited anxiously over the next few days to see if my replanted garden would survive. The revenge. For about a week, things were quiet. My garden remained undisturbed, and Karen seemed to be avoiding me. I was beginning to think maybe the matter was settled. Then, on the following Sunday, I was reviewing the security camera footage from the night before. I had gotten into the habit of checking it daily when I saw something that made my blood boil. The footage, captured around 2 a.m., clearly showed Karen sneaking onto our property with a pair of garden shears. She crept up to the survey stakes and began cutting the pink boundary string. Then she proceeded to try to pull up one of the metal stakes, struggling with it for several minutes before giving up. Finally, she took out a can of what looked like black spray paint and began to spray over the stake to obscure it. I was livid. This was no longer just a neighborly dispute. This was criminal trespassing and vandalism, caught clearly on camera. I immediately called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation, telling them I had clear video evidence of the crime. They promised to send an officer out that afternoon. While waiting for the police, I made several copies of the relevant security footage and saved it to a USB drive. I also printed out still images showing Karen clearly in the act. Officer Reynolds arrived around 2 p.m., and I was glad to see a familiar face. I showed him the footage, and he shook his head in disbelief. "Well, this is pretty clear-cut," he said. "Trespassing and vandalism with clear identification of the perpetrator. We'll need a copy of this footage for our report." I handed him the USB drive I had prepared. "Already done." Officer Reynolds thanked me and went next door to speak with Karen. From my front window, I could see her animated gestures and red face as she spoke with him. After about 15 minutes, Officer Reynolds returned. "Miss Karen has been issued citations for criminal trespassing and vandalism," he informed me. "She'll need to appear in court to answer for these charges. You may be called to testify." "I'm more than happy to do that," I replied. "Given the escalating nature of these incidents, I've also advised her that further actions against your property could result in more serious charges," Officer Reynolds added. "Hopefully that will put an end to this situation." I thanked Officer Reynolds for his help, and after he left, I went out to inspect the damage. The surveyor's string had been cut in several places, and one stake was covered in black spray paint, but it was still firmly in the ground, nothing that couldn't be fixed. I called the surveyor's office on Monday, explained the situation, and they agreed to come back out to replace the damaged markers at no additional charge. They also suggested I file the incident with the county property records office, so there would be an official note of the tampering attempt associated with both our properties. When the surveyor came to replace the damaged markers, he used even more visible materials, brighter marking paint on the ground in addition to the stakes and string, and he placed small flags at intervals along the boundary line. It was now impossible to claim any confusion about where one property ended and the other began. I also upgraded our security system, adding 2 more cameras and motion-activated floodlights around the perimeter of our property. If Karen tried anything again, not only would we have crystal-clear video evidence, but she'd be lit up like a Christmas tree while doing it. A few weeks later, I received a notice to appear in court for Karen's hearing. I gathered all my evidence, the original survey, the security footage, photos of the damage to my garden and the survey markers, and a timeline of events. The day of the hearing, I arrived early, dressed neatly in business casual attire. Karen showed up just before the proceedings began, looking somewhat frazzled. When her case was called, she seemed surprised to see me there. The judge reviewed the evidence, including the security camera footage, which was played in the courtroom. Karen's face grew increasingly red as the video showed her clear as day sneaking onto our property and vandalizing the survey markers. When given a chance to explain herself, Karen launched into a rambling story about how the land had always been hers and I was the one who had moved the property lines. The judge looked unimpressed. "Ma'am, the video evidence clearly shows you trespassing on the neighbor's property and vandalizing legally placed survey markers," the judge said sternly. "Property disputes need to be handled through proper legal channels, not by taking matters into your own hands in the middle of the night." In the end, Karen was found guilty of criminal trespassing and vandalism. She was ordered to pay a fine of $500, plus restitution of $250 for the damage to my garden. The judge also issued a restraining order requiring Karen to stay at least 10 feet away from the boundary line between our properties unless given explicit permission to approach. As we left the courtroom, Karen glared at me but said nothing. I simply nodded politely and walked away, feeling a sense of satisfaction that justice had been served. The resolution. The court case seemed to finally make an impression on Karen. In the months that followed, she kept her distance, and there were no further incidents of trespassing or vandalism. My vegetable garden flourished, and we even expanded it slightly. Still well within our property line, of course. About 6 months after the court case, a for sale sign appeared in front of Karen's house. I can't say I was disappointed to see it. The house sold quickly, and Karen moved out with minimal fuss. Our new neighbors are a young couple with a toddler, and they've been absolutely delightful so far. I even gave them some tomatoes and peppers from my garden as a welcome gift. Looking back on the whole ordeal, I'm glad I stood my ground and handled everything through proper legal channels. It would have been easy to get drawn into petty retaliation or escalating arguments, but that would have only made things worse. By documenting everything, involving the authorities when necessary, and letting the legal system work, I was able to protect my property and ultimately resolve the situation. And my garden? It's doing better than ever. There's something particularly satisfying about enjoying vegetables grown on land that I had to fight to defend. As for Karen, I heard through neighborhood gossip that she moved to a condo in a retirement community. I hope for her new neighbor's sake that there aren't any property lines for her to dispute there. The next one is a pro-revenge story. I was desperate to join a new job after my husband and I were both laid off last year. When I was offered a new role, I knew it would be a step down from what I was doing, but the manager and the team seemed great, and that part has not changed. However, since my manager Gary was so busy, he basically offloaded me to another manager, Jane. I was supposed to be the connection point between my team and Jane, but it quickly became Jane micromanaging me. She would ask me to work through lunch, cancel vacation days, call at 11 p.m. on weekends, and order me around on phone calls. She also made nasty comments about my weight and said I was big for my race. The list of personal slights so long that it filled 3 pages. I would talk back to her, and she did not like that, and that provoked her more. I only stayed because we needed to pay the bills. Finally, I had a mental breakdown on a Friday afternoon, after she yelled at me for something trivial about scheduling a meeting without including someone from her team who I didn't know about. I was dealing with a family tragedy and couldn't take it anymore. I told Gary about the situation with Jane, and he was sympathetic and not at all surprised considering half her team quit. He immediately offered to move me to a different team under him. I was thrilled. Well, turns out going to the new team didn't help. Jane continued to order me around from afar. When I ignored her emails, she came to my desk one day and started loudly talking about how I am not qualified for this role. Gary overheard and finally told her off, but the verbal abuse did not stop. After 2 months there, I abruptly wrote my resignation letter and stapled the list of Jane's offensive comments and CC'd everyone. Gary offered a bunch of accommodations to try to keep me, but seeing how she was still provoking from afar, I said the only way for me to stay would be for her to go, and he did not have authority to let her go. Her manager was in a different country, and despite several HR complaints from at least 5 people, nothing was done. So I left, loudly and without shame, telling everyone exactly why I was leaving. Times were very bad for 3 months. There were nights we would eat slices of bread just so we could pay the mortgage and emergency expenses from a health crisis and a funeral. Even after he found a job, we were still catching up on bills and still are. I spent months applying to 5, 10 roles per day, sometimes over 20. Last month, I saw a public memo about a big shot from a former company joining the company I just left. I used to work with this guy closely and texted him a congrats, let me know if you need any insights on the new place. We had a quick call where I told him some ins and outs, where I thought they could innovate. After this call, he asked me to join the team as his chief of staff. I accepted. Imagine Jane's shock when we had our first all-hands call. All the VPs and above were asked to welcome the new Big Shot in a giant conference room. In Big Shot's speech, he breezed over that I'll be his chief of staff, along with a few key names. I now sat 2 levels above Jane, and apparently within the 3 months I was not there, the other half of her team turned over. Every single person left. Gary was excited for me and said all nice things. However, Jane took the classless route and sent Big Shot an email about how I'm an unqualified idiot, that I used to work for her, how I tried to get her fired, and that she suspects I lied to get ahead. She didn't even try to be fake nice. Big Shot forwarded me her email and asked what this was about. I was so nervous and excited. Little did Jane know, I was a director at Big Shot's competitor company and was already a level above her, so 2 levels isn't a big leap, and I worked with him for 5 years. I had an hour call with Big Shot and told him she was bad for the company culture and was a nasty person in general, but the evidence he needed was Gary confirming that her whole team has turned over, my prior resignation letter, which was still sitting on my desktop when I logged in upon return, and a few other nasty emails she sent her recent staff, which they were happy to share with us. Big Shot fired Jane on Friday. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.